like tectonic plates, when they shift against one another, you get earthquakes, and that's what we're experiencing in our society right now, are the earthquakes as we're shifting the plates underlying our society. We're shifting from, well, I would say we shifted over 100 years ago away from the Judeo-Christian morality. That was the original plate that America was founded on. You can go back to the founders and the people that they read, and it's so clear. It's crystal clear that they were building a society based on that moral foundation. You got people like Wilson, Roosevelt, and others who came along 100 years later and said, we need to shift that. We need to shift the morality. But we're seeing an even bigger moral shift now to and it's not the first one. This has been going on for 200 years as well. We're just seeing it a lot in popular culture in particular, and at the university and in corporations. It's really manifesting itself throughout the different areas of society right now, which is this shift to a more Marx, giving deference and preference to Marx and his ideas, and the ideas that sprang from him. He's way up the genealogical ladder, you might say. There's been a lot of other thinkers since him, but you can trace them back to him and to Hegel, his mentor. And so that moral system, which is very different than the Judeo-Christian, we are shifting to that. And so that shifting is what causes, people don't understand, why am I being called racist, for example? Well, it's because there's different definitions of that word depending on which moral foundation you're coming from. And so if you're on a Judeo-Christian foundation, for example, if that's your background, and you get someone from the Marxian background calling you racist, they're thinking of a very different meaning of the word, and you're thinking of your meaning. And so we almost have to use a biblical reference, we almost have a Tower of Babel situation going on right now in America, where people are using the same words, but they have a different dictionary. And so they're talking past one another, and it's creating a great deal of friction and frustration and anger and even violence. And so it'll be interesting to see where our society goes. But that's kind of what makes me tick, is trying to understand what's happening, to the world that I'm trying to build, help build or perpetuate for my children and grandchildren. And is it leading to greater happiness and greater human flourishing, or are we heading in a wrong direction?
Hello, welcome back to another episode of How to Rewrite Your Stars. I'm your host, Benjamin Fincher, joined today by Gary Arnell. Super glad to have you, Gary.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. So Gary Arnell is the Chief Administration Officer at Williamsburg Learning, an online secondary school. He is also the founder of Culture Stack, a blog and podcast that explores the relationship between the moral, political, economic, and cultural ideas that compromise every society, and is especially interested in the mixture that created Western civilization, which has been responsible for more freedom, prosperity, and health than any other in human history. In his spare time, Gary enjoys family, community service, travel, and the outdoors, especially canyoneering. And I just got to say, before we dive into this, those that have listened to the podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about Greg Denning, and I had him on the show about 10 episodes ago. Excuse me. And Greg has a podcast, and I saw that Gary was a guest on Greg's podcast, and I'm like, oh, that's got to be good, because I went to Williamsburg Learning when it was still Williamsburg Academy, which is where I even met Greg. So in a lot of ways, this is all just coming full circle, and I love it. And I listened to this episode that Gary and Greg did, and I was just blown away. And I was like, dude, I got to have Gary on here and like get more on an individual basis with this. I think I'll reference that episode in the show notes too that you and Greg did, so that people can go hop over there and listen to that if they want.
That was a lot of fun.
But I'm stoked. I'm super stoked. So I'm not even sure where to start with this because there's so much. I guess maybe, would you mind giving us a brief synopsis, kind of what that episode with you and Greg entailed? And obviously that's a tall order, but
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, Greg and I knew each other from Williamsburg. And the academy's still there. It's just a private school. Williamsburg Learning has partners with non-private entities, public schools and so forth. So it's still
Okay.
there. But
Okay.
so yeah, we worked together there for quite a while. Greg, of course, is a world traveler and knows lots of people in lots of different countries, and we've continued to stay in touch since that time, and we've done a number of things in the outdoors, canyoneering usually, which
Right.
is basically rappelling through slot canyons in places like Zion National Park. There's places in Europe where it's done as well, but it's a way to get into nature that not very many people can go and do because it requires that technical element of rope work and so forth.
Right.
And you have a lot of time to hike and walk and talk with your companions as you're doing that. And so we always engage in really fun conversations. And so that's where the kind of the genesis of me going on his podcast was from, is from those conversations we were having out in the outdoors. But basically, we talked about trying to understand where Western civilization is right now, particularly America, but the larger scope of Western civilization and the transformations that are occurring within it, which certainly impact, I think, the work that you do. Because we're all boats floating on the ocean of Western civilization
Oh yeah.
and America. How we talked about how America had its initial founding back in the 1700s, a founding of classic liberalism, which is a certain set of ideas about the purpose of life and the purpose of government to support that purpose of life. And America really underwent a second founding about 100 years later when progressivism came along. And so we talked about that and how that's different, and how that prescribes a different purpose of life and of government, and how we're going through now a third founding right now. And it's why you experience this tumult in societies, because we're literally changing our society. It's changing underneath us, for better or for worse. And that's a conversation certainly to be had. But we're now in a third founding, which is it's a little more difficult to label because there's a lot of splinters or factions of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's basically a Hegelian, Marxist, postmodern, identity-based worldview that we're now moving towards. And what I did is something I learned when I was in my graduate program, is that you can model any society by looking at it. Basically has layers, and this is where the name of my own podcast and blog came from. It's called Culture Stack, and it's the idea that any culture, any society throughout history can be modeled by looking first at its moral layer, which is what it believes about right and wrong, good and bad, evil, the purpose of life, whether there's a heaven or not.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got Buddha, you've got Christ, you've got Moses, you've got Marx, prophets, Homer, prophets, poets, philosophers. They're the ones who espouse these ideas that give us a moral layer. And on top of that, you have a political layer, which is where you have statesmen who codify, who say that moral layer, we need to make that the layer for our society. And so they codify it. And so you see the Greek states being built on Homer's ideas of the right way to live. You see communist countries being based on the way that Marx said that we live. You have Western civilization being built on a combination of Judeo-Christian. So you've got Moses, you've got Jesus, you've also got some Greek and Roman influence that came in there, and they codified the legal structure, the Constitution, for example, based on that moral layer. So you've got the moral layer, the political layer, and then on top of that, you've got an economic layer. There's been feudalism, mercantilism, capitalism, free enterprise. There's a lot of different ways for people to interact with one another. Socialism. These are ways that people interact with one another, and they're built on or influenced by the layers underneath, the moral and the political. And you could have capitalism in America, which will look very different than capitalism in China, for example, because the moral and political layers underneath capitalism are very different. So capitalism manifests itself quite differently in that environment. And then on top of that, you have the cultural layer, which is, what does family look like? are there churches? What do they look like, and what purposes do they serve? How do we treat the poor, the needy, the elderly, if we treat them at all, like Sparta? If you were weak, you died, and that was okay because that was, the Spartan ethic, but embodied that, way of being.
We are warriors.
We're warriors, exactly. It was a martial society, whereas ours is a commercial society, and there's different kinds of societies, and they all flow up from that moral, political, economic, cultural, and by understanding the interplay of those, you can better understand what's happening in the world around you. You can better discern what's happening in the news. For example, you get a lot of talk right now about the evils of capitalism, where you might actually, the evils that they're talking about really are probably concerns they have about the moral and the political layer, but they're like mislabeling those concerns. Like capitalism doesn't take care of the poor. It's like, aha, there's a moral assertion in there that the economic system should be taking care of the poor. And so it's like, well, let's go look at the fathers of, let's go look at Adam Smith, for example. What did he say about, free enterprise? So you can pick apart and better understand what's happening around you. So we talked about that stack. We talked about those three foundings of America. And we talked about what individuals, citizens can do or ought to do to participate in that, because if we're all, like I mentioned before, we're all boats floating on the sea of whatever culture and society we live in. Mm-hmm. And if that current is going in a certain way, we may have an opinion about where we want that current to go. We may be headed towards a waterfall, or maybe it might, what is it heading towards choppy waters? Is there anything we can do about that? So those are basically, in a nutshell, really quickly, some of the topics we covered.
Yeah, that was beautifully summed up, way better than I could have ever attempted to. At least at the moment, I'm striving to learn more to be able to articulate like that. And as you're saying that, I know you'd mentioned in your podcast with Gary that it's kind of like a technology stack, like you said something like a server stack or something. It also makes me think of, I'm trying to remember the name, but those science experiments where you stick various layers of like sediments, in particular organic matter, and if you set them in the right order, then you create a viable system. But if they're in the wrong order, then it all dies. I'm trying to remember. It's like done in a bill jar. Do you know what I'm talking about there? Would happen to know the name?
I'm not, but that makes a lot of sense. It's like with a recipe, when you add the ingredients in a certain order, or you get a very different end result. Yeah. And understanding the right order, understanding the ingredients helps you improve the recipe. And you're right about that stack idea. My professional background's in technology, and so there is the concept in technology of a stack. What's your server? What operating system are you running on that server? What software are you running on that server? So like a LAMP stack, if you're a technology person, would be Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. So anyway, the idea that in society there's a stack as well, that you can, just like with that soil example, you might need to know the interplay between them and tweak that, and that'll give you the end result that you want. And the same is true of this culture stack, that what ails us may not be at the cultural level. It may not be at the economic level, even though that's where you see a lot of the attention being paid. The problem may be at the political layer. The problem may be at the moral layer, or the what's actually shifting may be at the moral layer. And that's the argument that I was making in that particular conversation with Greg, is that like tectonic plates, when they shift against one another, you get earthquakes, and that's what we're experiencing in our society right now, are the earthquakes as we're shifting the plates underlying our society. We're shifting from, I would say we shifted over 100 years ago away from the Judeo-Christian morality. That was the original plate that America was founded on. You can go back to the founders and the people that they read, and it's so clear. It's crystal clear that they were building a society based on that moral foundation. You got people like Wilson, Roosevelt, and others who came along 100 years later and said, we need to shift that. We need to shift the morality. But we're seeing an even bigger moral shift now to and it's not the first one. This has been going on for 200 years as well. We're just seeing it a lot in popular culture in particular, and at the university and in corporations. It's really manifesting itself throughout the different areas of society right now, which is this shift to a more Marx, giving deference and preference to Marx and his ideas, and the ideas that sprang from him. He's way up the genealogical ladder, you might say. There's been a lot of other thinkers since him, but you can trace them back to him and to Hegel, his mentor. And so that moral system, which is very different than the Judeo-Christian, we are shifting to that. And so that shifting is what causes, people don't understand, why am I being called racist, for example? Well, it's because there's different definitions of that word depending on which moral foundation you're coming from. And so if you're on a Judeo-Christian foundation, for example, if that's your background, and you get someone from the Marxian background calling you racist, they're thinking of a very different meaning of the word, and you're thinking of your meaning. And so we almost have to use a biblical reference, we almost have a Tower of Babel situation going on right now in America, where people are using the same words, but they have a different dictionary. And so they're talking past one another, and it's creating a great deal of friction and frustration and anger and even violence. And so it'll be interesting to see where our society goes. But that's kind of what makes me tick, is trying to understand what's happening, to the world that I'm trying to build, help build or perpetuate for my children and grandchildren. And is it leading to greater happiness and greater human flourishing, or are we heading in a wrong direction? So that's kind of what I do in my spare time, is delve into those subjects.
Right. And at the place I'd just been working as a piano repairman, I had a coworker that was super into philosophy, and, we'd get talking, all the time after I was done working, and he was there, and, he'd be talking about Plato and Aristotle and Nicomachean ethics and, all these different things from, a couple thousand years ago that I'm not entirely sure why I always just dismissed them. I think I had one of my teachers give me a comment that kind of said philosophy was bad. And so I just kind of have ignored it until finally this year. And then I'm like, wait a second, this stuff actually has some stuff to it. And so, I've been kind of diving into that with him. And I'm just like, wait, there's some stuff here that seems good. And at the same time, I'm just barely scratching the surface. And then I look at you and I'm like, wait, what does Gary think about Nicomachean ethics, or, all these other things, that happiness is the, however Aristotle says it, basically the end for its own end. And it's just gotten very interesting for me. And it's kind of opened up a new world of oh, wait, this is and philosophy defined is the science of thinking. Right.
Yeah. The love of wisdom. I feel like, because I didn't learn this stuff until I was a parent, after my graduate, I was in graduate school when I started to learn about this stuff. And honestly, it feels like a stolen inheritance, in that the life that you and I live, this living in this prosperous, free, healthy society where we can each pursue a purpose. You speak a lot and speak with a lot of people about finding your purpose. What is your vision for your life? Think back to 200 years ago, 500 years ago, just 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and then all of human history before that. How many people even got to ask those questions? For what you now are trying to pursue as a career would have been an absolute luxury at any other period in human existence. So it's what changed? What made it so that Benjamin Fincher could even have a podcast that talks about rewriting your stars and finding out your vision and saying, hey, everyone can do this? Because that hasn't always been true in human history. Most people were serfs, they were peasants, they were illiterate, they were innumerate. They were living in poverty. They had short, nasty, brutish lives. There's a lot of human history that was just waiting for the next Mongolian conqueror to take over your village. We are the most blessed and fortunate of, I would say, I think of, in general, generally speaking, throughout human history. So what changed? What made that possible? And that's part of what philosophy tries to explore is what we have. What I would propose is that what we have, the privileges that we enjoy, are not the norm, and they're not self-perpetuating. And that's the most concerning thing to me, is that freedom and human rights are not. They required an understanding of human nature, of the human condition, and creating structures that channeled power as far as government goes, because most governments in the past existed for the benefit of a very few, and everyone else got the short end of the stick. And the American dream, the idea behind Western civilization, is that no, the common man can live an excellent life, can live an extraordinary life, can be happy. Yeah. And so that conversation that's been going on for thousands of years of wrestling with those questions really came to, starting particularly in the West, at least, with people like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Hume, Aquinas, etc. It came to a blossoming in the 16 and 1700s. And you had this unusual generation of people in Europe and then in America with the Enlightenment, for example, and then over in America, where they brought all these ideas together and figured out how to structure a government around those ideas. And so many people start with like the Declaration and the Constitution and say that's where they start, and they don't look at the writings that gave birth to the Declaration and the Constitution.
Was it Locke that you mentioned in one of your
Locke? Yeah, Locke was huge. Locke was huge. You go read, Madison, and he's channeling Locke. So you've got, I went and looked. I live in the state of Utah, and I went a year or so ago. Went back and looked at the civics curriculum taught in Utah high schools, and it starts basically at Declaration and Constitution, and those two documents are fantastic. And there's so much conversation you can have, but it's so much richer and better if you go one layer deeper. It's like they left out the first chapter about freedom. It's like you have to go to that next layer down at least, and study the writings at the time of the founding that gave birth to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, to understand the mindset and the understanding about human nature that gave birth to those two documents, and from that birth gave birth to the enormous explosion in innovation, creativity, growth, personal growth, and therefore community growth, and therefore societal growth that came out of the Enlightenment, out of what has become Western civilization. So yes, philosophy, absolutely. That's why I feel like it's a stolen inheritance, is because those ideas, they're rare in human history. They're not self-perpetuating. They're not intuitive. That's what perhaps has been the biggest thing that struck me, is that they're not intuitive. You have to wrestle with them and see them from their perspective, and like, why did you do it that way? Why did you set things up that way? And well, here's why. And they go through the line. And if we don't,
the Federalist Papers is where it kind of,
like in the Federalist Papers, they just labored and wrestled with all these questions. And so if we don't study those same things, we run the risk. It's kind of like, I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan. I really enjoyed at least the first three Star Wars movies. And in the very first one, there's Luke Skywalker in the Millennium Falcon for the very first time with Han Solo. And he's like, why don't you just make the jump to hyperspeed? And Han Solo, who's the experienced pilot, says, well, if I did that, I might fly through an asteroid field or something like that. Han Solo knew that the full journey to where they were trying to go had obstacles in the way, and that you had to navigate around, or you wouldn't make it to your final destination. Whereas Luke Skywalker was completely unfamiliar with interstellar travel, had no idea about the obstacles and wanted to just jump the gun and travel in the wrong direction, is essentially what he wanted to do. He
Yeah.
didn't know that there was a navigation required to avoid the obstacles. And freedom is very much like that. There are many obstacles, mostly within our own nature, that we have to navigate around and take into account when building societal structures, including government. There's other societal structures that have to be built, and there's an interplay between them. You've got family, you've got government, you've got community, the arts, churches, schools, businesses, etc. There's a number of, and they've got an interplay, and they can interplay wrong. They can interplay in the wrong way, and that will reduce freedom, reduce happiness, and so understanding all of that. There's this basic knowledge, citizenship 101, you might call it, that is essential to perpetuate, freedom and the opportunities that you and I have to then pursue our own individual life purpose. That if we don't perpetuate, we're gonna have fewer and fewer opportunities to pursue our own purpose, and instead are going to be doing what our masters tell us.
Yeah.
If it goes to that, extent. And so, and one of the things we talked about with Greg was, The Great Conversation, which it's a book titled after a movement. The Great Conversation or the Great Debate is that philosophical conversation that's been happening for thousands of years. It is people, the brightest, the smartest, having conversations over the millennia, battling. It's a battle of ideas back and forth. And those, you can go back and read them and decide for yourself, did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? And they don't agree with each other. They're often very much at odds.
Mm-hmm.
Marx, for example, is in that tradition. There's a book, his book is included among the great writings because he's had such a tremendous influence on Western civilization in particular, and Eastern now. And so the Great Conversation it's also it's now an essay. There's an essay by, I think it's Mortimer Adler or Robert Hutchins. Decades ago, they compiled a set of books called the Great Books of the Western World that try to take the greatest writings on all of these subjects to represent the highest state of the art
Is that
freedom.
Those orange-bound books?
I think they come in different. There's different editions. You can see mine back here, not the red ones. That's the Harvard set, but maybe you're right. I don't know if we're on video or if we're on audio, but it's the Great Books series, Britannica Great Books. You can go look it up on the internet.
Okay.
You can pick it up for a few $100s. Very much worth it, I would say. But the idea is that, much like if you were, whatever your passion in life is, whether it's medicine or engineering or law or theater or what have you, there are others that came before you who also explored that art and took it to the next level. So we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, right?
Yeah.
In whatever field we're in. Now we can say, I'm going to ignore the giants. I'm going to ignore those who came before me, and I'm going to start over. That seems like a very impractical, unwise thing to do. There's, our lifetime is only so long. There's no way we can go through the learning process that's already been gone through for millennia in whatever field of years, for thousands of years. And so it would behoove us, whatever our purpose in life, to study the masters and learn what they knew. And then we might find flaws or go beyond them. We may exceed them. And that's how society keeps progressing and getting better and better, is people study the masters in the field that they're in, and then they build on top of that. We should each... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say an example with that. I saw an interview with an engineer that was part of the Apollo program and that space program back in the 60s. And, the interview was done like less than 5 years ago. And the guy interviewing says, well, what do you think about engineers nowadays? Do you think you guys, were the top of the stuff back then, and that it's kind of deteriorated? And he says, every age of engineers, like, we all build on each other. I built on people before me, and they built on people like me and others. And, I also wanted to mention about, that example with hyperspace, with Han Solo and Luke. I actually was talking with a group of my mastermind last night about that same idea with my business. I'm like, I keep thinking I have to have everything calculated out for the next 20 years or more, and basically make sure I'm cleared for a hyperspace jump. I'm not going to do that. I just need to make sure that I can navigate at supersonic speeds. I don't have to navigate at superluminal speeds. But somebody that's setting up a form of government that's meant to last for hundreds of years does need to make sure it's set for superluminal speeds or superluminal destination.
I think there's a difference between what has been explored before and what hasn't. So if the greats before us have already discovered the best practices in building bridges or in accounting or in leadership or dealing with people or whatever it happens to be, those are the asteroid fields that we want to avoid. We want to avoid, if the best practices in our industry have already been identified, we don't want to go against those and break ourselves against them by violating them ignorantly.
Yeah.
We want to understand them. That's where the study of the masters comes into place. And then we want to build on top of that. And that's where we're in the unknown. Now we're in the unknown. Now we can't be at hyperspace anymore. We've got to, because now we're making our way through unknown territory that hasn't been traveled before. So there's both of those skill sets that are necessary. One, know what has been learned before so well that you can discover if there's errors in it, because that's totally possible. That's what Einstein did. He took Newtonian physics and said, aha, this is limited. It works great if you're on the Earth, but as soon as you start involving things outside of the Earth, it breaks down. It's insufficient, and so he went beyond it, and he found so he studied those masters, and then he went beyond it and found what the limitations of Newtonian physics were, for example.
Right.
And because of that, we have GPS and cell phones and space travel to a degree, and all of that is impossible under Newtonian physics, totally possible under Einstein's theory of relativity. And so that I think that would be a good distinction to make is when we set out to blaze new trails in our lives, don't
burn the bridges along the way.
Don't burn the bridges along the way. Learn from the masters that preceded you, which requires humility and requires maybe taking a slower route than you might otherwise want to do. Some of us are really, go-getters and quick starters, and we want to just go at it. But and there is value in learning lessons the hard way, the school of hard knocks, but that burns precious time.
Yeah.
We only have a limited amount of time. And so that's where, trade programs in college and university, things like that can be very helpful, is that if you know what you want to study and you know which direction you want to go, they can provide you with the benefit of that already learned knowledge that took many lifetimes to acquire. So you can now spend the rest of your lifetime in the unknown zone and then add to that body of knowledge.
And it reminds me, I've got a couple of friends. One of them studied to be some kind of engineer. I forget which type specifically, but dealing with bridges. At least in part. And they were talking, we were having a game day or whatever, and they got talking about, the process to build even like a 10-foot bridge is ridiculously long and blah, blah, blah. When I actually get in there and start being an engineer, I'm going to cut that time in half and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, there may be a little bit of there may be a little bit of bureaucracy in the process, but there's probably a lot less than you think. There's probably very high percentage of everything that's done that takes that super long process of months to make a 10-foot long bridge. Probably most of that necessary, and there's very little you can actually cut out without compromising the safety of it. I don't know. I'm not a structural engineer or a bridge engineer or anything, but just hearing them talk, I'm like, okay, I know you're not going to want to cut corners, but with that approach, you will, unless you're very aware of what all goes into it.
It is possible for the arts, whatever art it is, whatever practice, it is possible for it to become corrupted. That is very much possible. Governments can become corrupted. The trades can become corrupted. I remember reading an article in The Lancet, which is like the UK's leading medical journal, a couple 3 years ago, that said that they suspected that 50% of all medical studies published at the time nowadays were improperly done. We're compromised because for various reasons, either bad practices or more often because the scientists involved had ulterior motives. They were being paid by a particular company, for example. It's like what happened with sugar when the sugar companies paid scientists to tell the world and show the world that sugar was just fine, and it was milk and it was eggs and animal fats that were actually bad for us. When I was a child, I remember hearing, seeing those advertisements, how eggs are bad for you. And it was all because it's like, the same thing happened with cigarettes, where you had, cigarettes were sold in hospitals to patients in their beds, because there were vested interests that wanted to see their products succeed. And so they used the scientific community to falsely tout and promote their product with enormous success. I mean, sugar, the obesity problem in America is largely traceable back to that malpractice within the scientific community, where they prostituted their art to a vested interest. And that, that's gonna, that we are always susceptible to that. And that is, classic liberalism is the one solution that I see that humans have come up with. That's what the American founding was founded on, was classic liberalism, which seeks to use reason, empiricism, etc., to find truth. And so you don't listen to the vested interests, you reject the vested interests, and truth is your actual pursuit. And we could certainly get into classic liberalism and why it's, because I feel like I think we have become illiberal. We are no longer we no longer follow classic liberalism. And so we do see that corruption happening more and more. We're seeing it in the universities, we're seeing it in the corporations, we're seeing it in the sciences, and we're seeing in the professions, where there are examples out there of engineers, for example, having or in school at university, because they are a particular ethnic or sexual orientation that is considered desirable. If they get wrong answers on their assignments, they're allowed to pass through anyway, for example. That would be malpractice. It's an illiberal malpractice, because the art is made subservient to some type of moral or political ideal. That's illiberal, and then serves as a danger to, if that person goes on to build bridges or airplanes or or car engines or what happens to be. The likelihood of error increases because they weren't subjected to the rigor that classic liberalism, that the pursuit of truth would require.
Right. And I want to make a point here with that, because up until you just started talking about classic liberalism just here, bringing up that example of, oh yeah, people can cut corners and all this stuff, or they can sell, sugar and tout it as awesome. Many, many, many of my peers that I've talked to are just like, see, that's what's wrong with capitalism. They just go in there. It's all about making money. It doesn't matter at all. Like, if people suffer, it doesn't matter. I earned the more money. It's the bottom line. That's all that matters. And, they bring up examples of, like, when that one company basically addicted babies to baby formula that the parents couldn't afford, or, when a company cuts corners, or when that one scientist created the leaded gasoline that damaged the entire world on a severe level. In all these different levels. And anytime I've had a discussion about something like that with them, they almost without fail bring up, see, this is what's wrong with capitalism. Capitalism is terrible. And I want to look at them, I'm like, what alternative do you propose? And it goes back to the moral layer.
Yes,
and that's where the issue
exactly.
lies.
Yes. You can. I mean, capitalism is, you might say, it's amoral. It inherits whatever moral framework it's being employed within. It's about the division of labor, for example. It's about, that's going back to Adam Smith. That was his big point about the division of labor. But But you're right. It goes back to the moral layer. You can be honest or dishonest within capitalism. You can be honest or dishonest within feudalism. You can be honest or dishonest within mercantilism. You can be an honest or dishonest king, within monarchy as a political layer. The question is, what's happening at the moral layer? You travel. I have a colleague who was traveling in France this summer and had her laptop stolen, and apparently the pickpockets there are just terrible. It's just commonly accepted that there's just pickpockets everywhere. I have a friend who traveled to San Francisco in the last year or two, and they had thieves break the window of their car and steal their purse out of their car. And they contacted the police, and the police said, there's nothing we can do about that. It's so common. We can't deal with it. We only deal with crimes of this level or higher. Wow. And so there's a moral, and yet there's other places where you don't even have to lock your door at night. So it's like, what's happening there? There's a moral layer that's different in those different places. And that then bleeds up to that economic layer. People are going to behave. Their behavior within their economic layer is not entirely.
All right, we back.
And that was my internet going out, so I switched over to my hotspot. Sorry about that. Hopefully, we can cut that out of the final production. Where did I lose you? Where did you lose me?
That's where that bleeds off into the economic layer.
Yeah. So I apologize for that little blurb, and my internet is still down. So, So the economic layer is absolutely influenced by the moral and political layers underneath it. And I think that's what your friends are referring to. And it's quite honestly, I feel like a lot of our mass media outlets have that same attitude. They're hitting on capitalism as the source of that, rather than at the moral or political layers that are informing people's actions in the economic realm.
Yeah. And it ends up as a scapegoat, whether or not people recognize it or not.
Yeah, a scapegoat, and they start pushing for alternative methods. They're basically like physicians, false physicians, because they're not even, experts in that area, but they push for a remedy for the wrong disease.
Yeah.
And that's what's the most dangerous, because you're going to spend the time and the money on that false remedy and likely get something much worse as a result.
That's a lot harder to get rid of.
That's even then a lot harder to get rid of. You get further and further away from what the actual cause is, and you get layer upon layer of malpractice or even obfuscation. So it becomes more and more difficult to even perceive what the real problems are, and it becomes a Gordian knot, a tangled web that becomes extremely difficult to untie, and people get frustrated and angry and despondent and fighting with one another. And it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah. And I guess here's a good question to ask. What do we do as individuals to avoid that bad outcome and end up maintaining the liberties, the freedom that we have? Because as you mentioned earlier, we, compared to all of human history, practically have the most freedom, the most ability to pursue whatever path we want to in life. And it's not technology that's doing that. Just to clarify that for anyone that may think that. It's not technology that's done this. It's the system of government. It was based on a certain moral layer, but then it's the system of government that's perpetuated, that's allowed this to continue. Like, am I getting that right there?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned, Aristotle's Ethics. We could certainly get into that, because and this is where, the inheritance, the lost or stolen inheritance that I referred to earlier, I feel is what we are hitting up against. People are not dumb. People are ignorant. Yeah. We are highly trained. We are a very highly trained citizenry, poorly educated. There's a difference between education and training. My training is in software engineering, in technology. That's not an education. That's a training. That's a vocation. That doesn't teach me about the world. It doesn't teach me about human nature. It doesn't teach me how to live as a human being. It teaches me how to write software programs, how to run databases. Those are two very, very different things. So one of my qualms with the education, where our education industry has gone, and that's why I've switched from IT to education, is to try to be part of a movement to try to bring back the idea that education needs to be, schools need to provide education, not just training.
Yeah.
I think, for example, of the subjects that we teach our children, calculus, trigonometry, advanced geometry, even advanced chemistry and physics, which are all wonderful fields, especially particularly for those who are going to need them for their training. For what, if you're going to be an engineer, if you're going to be a doctor, there's certainly those things that they're going to need. But we're giving that to everyone and giving to none of them, pretty much, any of the classical liberalism concepts, the Plato, the Socrates, the Aristotle, the Hume, the Locke, the Smith, the Aquinas. We're not getting into any of that. And so they don't realize that the freedoms that they enjoy are built on that foundation. And so they're willing to take stances politically in the voters' booth that are antithetical to the freedoms that they enjoy, just because they haven't been told, they haven't been taught the delicate framework that's required to maintain freedom. And that's where we could get in. Go ahead.
Or even more scarily, they reject it because of the little education they think they have.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're like, that can't be it. Of course, this other solution is it. I love in Louis L'Amour's autobiography, Education of a Wandering Man. I read it years ago and had somebody share this screenshot where I remembered this quote in it. He says basically, I stopped going to school, and I think it was in 10th grade or something, because it was interfering with my education.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the most famous quote from that book. Yeah. He's a remarkable Renaissance man, loved all of his books. And that's, he was a merchant marine. He traveled the world and gained all this experience from that. I believe we have left behind, and that's, I mentioned the Great Conversation as being that this debate that has been going on for thousands of years. It's also the title of this essay written. It's the volume 1 of this series that you can go get, the Britannica Great Books. And they make this case. They said that Western civilization was built on ideas. It's like the first civilization that was built on ideas rather than a common religion, a common ethnicity, a common heritage of some sort. It is a civilization built on ideas. And so it can be given to any other society that we can gift it. In fact, that's what's happened. These ideas have been given to, and you can keep all your beautiful traditions of music and food and clothing and your traditions and so forth in your history. You can keep all of that, but be more free by implementing the ideas of the Great Conversation, of classic liberalism. Yeah. And we've stopped studying them, we've stopped propagating them, we've stopped passing them along to our children, and so they don't know how to navigate that asteroid field that we talked about earlier, and propose and often the ideas that are counter to sound really good, but you're only seeing so far. You don't see where they actually lead if you follow them to their logical conclusions. So people will espouse and stand for and advocate for ideas that they don't see the interplay that idea has with all the other aspects of human nature and society, and how it actually is catastrophic to go down that path. Capitalism, some of the complaints about capitalism would be a good example there, where capitalism isn't meant, it isn't, there's a way to optimally, well, you can do capitalism poorly and you can do capitalism well, depending on the moral and political layer you've got underneath you. Well, what are the moral and political layer? We don't talk about those almost at all, really. We talk about the current events that are happening in those areas, but we don't study the ideas and the philosophy. I think Aristotle is a great place for people to start, because he dives into that question of what is the greatest good that each of us are trying to pursue. What is the greatest good we can pursue, and how do we actually get there? What do humans have to do to be happy? That applies to everyone. Why are we not studying that, in high school, for example?
Yeah. Well, and, talking about that again, it reminds me, he lists out a various number of, I think he calls them virtues, that each human ought to have in order to be happy. And it reminds me of the founding ideals of America. We really only ever hear about hard work anymore. Out of, I think there were seven. And I don't know all of them. I want to, but I haven't studied them well enough to know what they are. But the one that really struck me when I was learning about it, and it makes me think I ought to have this guy who I learned it from on the podcast as well to talk about this. Gov Allen, if he ends up on the podcast, you'll know to go listen to that episode. It might happen, it might not. But he was telling about public virtue. And he gave an example of it. And this, it was one of the statesmen, one of the politicians at the time during the Revolutionary War had his son captured and held on a prison ship. And the British generals and officials were writing him from the prison ship saying, hey, your son is on the prison ship. We are beating him daily. Here's what you can do to, have him released. And it was things that would have affected the founding of America in a very negative way. And either he responded or didn't respond. But if he did respond, it was basically like, I'm not going to do anything. I think he didn't respond. And I wish I knew who it was, but, and then it goes further and they're like, okay, we've stopped giving him food. And either he responded, resolutely or didn't respond. And then eventually he gets a letter that says, your son has starved to death. Like he's dead because you didn't act. And the reason that this man didn't act is because it was not in the interest of public virtue. It was very much within his interest personally as a family man to save his son, but it was not in the interest of public virtue to affect his community, his country so negatively for as simple as one man. And we have so lost that.
Yeah. Private virtue versus public virtue were two of the concepts at the time of the founding. Private virtue, I think they got from Aristotle, is where he talked about that in ethics. And then public virtue, as you said, is acting in a way that benefits the greater whole. And I don't remember who it was either, but I remember that story. And basically it was either he had to choose his son or he had to choose whatever it was that they wanted him to do to free his son would have had a tremendously negative effect on the progress of the revolution.
Yeah, it was basically like to refuse to sign the Declaration of Independence or something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what it was they were demanding of him, but
it was something big.
It was something big, yeah. And so he chose the greater good over his own son, which is, if you're a parent, how do you, I think all of us can empathize or sympathize with like how difficult of a decision that was. But even the idea of public virtue can be traced back, I think, to Aristotle's ethics, because justice is the greatest virtue. It's ensuring. Anyway, yeah, we could get into that if you'd like, but we've, basically there's. You might be able to, there's I don't know if there's two theories of happiness. There's eudaimonic happiness and hedonic happiness. Hedonic or hedonism is just seeking pleasure. Whatever makes you feel good in the moment. So you're always just pursuing what's going to make you feel good. That's hedonism or hedonic happiness or pleasure. And what Aristotle advocated for, because he explored pleasure, but he explored eudaimonia or eudaimonic, which is the life spirit, the good spirit, the happiness, the good life. And it wasn't through the pursuit of pleasure. He wasn't against pleasure, but he said pleasure actually needs to be sought for within a greater framework. And you don't begin with the seeking of pleasure. You have to, that happiness is actually, you achieve happiness through the pursuit of virtue, which becomes character. And there's a whole that we could take up the rest of our time just talking about that. And it probably would be time well spent, because I don't know how many Americans ever even hear of that. And yet it is the foundation.
I don't think I have.
Yeah. It's, I'll try to give a quick summary of it, because it's just brilliant, it literally forms. I mean, it's pre-Christian. This is like 350 BC that Aristotle was writing, but he was an incredibly prolific polymath. He wrote books on just about every subject. That I mean, it's just an incredible, one of the greatest philosophers ever. And yet you'll see them. I've seen them online be downplayed or ridiculed as being ancient and therefore no longer relevant. But to me, that's just I see our society rejecting the shoulders that they're standing on, and eventually will be like the coyote. I don't know if when I was a kid, you had the Wile E. Coyote chasing the Roadrunner all the time, and he would run off a cliff, and he would be above be over the cliff, running in midair, and then eventually would fall. I feel like we in Western civilization, America, are very much like that coyote, suspended in midair with our right legs running. And then we have this look of when we suddenly realize that, like, oh, there's nothing underneath us. We haven't reached that point yet. We're still running in midair. We haven't realized the degree to which we are removing what holds us up. Yeah. But Aristotle, gosh, it is a difficult book. It's a very dense book. It's like every sentence says so much, and so I'm trying to think of the best way to summarize it. But it might be, I did a Google search at one point, just asking what is you can get it from the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence says that among the purposes of life, or the human rights that we all have, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What does pursuit of happiness mean? It's like, it's written there as like, here's why we're having a revolution. First of all, here's why we're going to set up a whole new different kind of government, is to allow for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think most of us know what life means for the most part. I'm not sure that we know what liberty means, because there's a whole construct behind that one too.
Oh, I feel like that word's evolved over the years as well.
That word has evolved as well. Yeah. But what does the pursuit of happiness mean? We think we know what it means. And if you go Google, what is the pursuit of happiness? Most of the results will be whatever you decide. It's whatever you decide.
Which is hedonistic then, right?
Well, it can be, or you might decide that tending a garden makes you happy. In fact, that's one of the Google results. Keeping goats, having a garden. It's whatever you decide, as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others, then that's happiness. And I even see it, I've got this book, I don't think I have it on my desk right now, but George F. Will, this very well-respected conservative thinker. I think I'm reading one of his books that he put out a couple of years ago, called I think it's The Conservative Mind. I don't remember exactly, but he gets this wrong too. It's like, no, that the pursuit of happiness was not defined by the founders. Like, no, they did define it. It was Jefferson wrote about how he was influenced directly by Aristotle, and Aristotle wrote the book on happiness. And essentially, Aristotle said that all of us, everything we do everything we do is for some other purpose. One of the examples that I gave when I was talking with Greg is, if you have a tool, a hammer and a nail, you don't just have a hammer and a nail just to have a hammer and nail. You have them to build something, a house, for example. And you don't have that house just to have a house. You have it so you can raise your family, for example. And you don't just have a family just to have a family. You believe that having a family, being married and having children, for example, is going to bring about something else. It's going to bring about some purpose or some happiness. So he said there's this hierarchy in life that we always are, whatever we're pursuing for something greater. We go to school, we get an education, not just to get an education, but with the intent of doing something with it, of achieving something greater. They're all ingredients in some recipe that we're working on. And he says the ultimate thing that we're all pursuing, every single human being ever, is happiness. We're seeking to be happy. Well, that's the end. It's the greatest good that any of us can ever achieve. Yeah. That's what we're seeking for.
Because you don't seek happiness for some other end. It's happiness for happiness' sake.
Yes, happiness is the end. That is the final good. There is nothing beyond happiness. Well, okay, what is happiness? And then he spends hundreds of pages digging into what is this idea of happiness. And it's not hedonistic. It's not the pursuit of pleasure. Pleasure is certainly a good, but it's actually subservient to, it's lower on that hierarchy, and needs to be compatible with the higher pursuit of happiness. And so, in a nutshell, and I hope I don't do a disservice to Aristotle, because it really deserves contemplation and reading and really wrestling with this. But he said that happiness comes by pursuing virtue. Well, what is virtue? Virtue is acting in the way you are created to act. Something is virtuous because it performs the function for which it was created. So, for example, a Delphian sword, a sword from Delphi, going back to Greece, was a virtuous sword if it was sharp and performed the sacrifice, and it helps you perform the sacrifice you were trying to perform. If it was dull, and so you weren't able to perform your sacrifice, it wasn't a virtuous sword. And so a cup, a spoon, a chair, they're virtuous if they fulfill the purpose for which they were created. It's like, well, I think we can all understand that idea. He says humans are the exact same way. Humans were created for a particular purpose, and they are virtuous if they are pursuing that purpose, if they're acting in accordance with that purpose. Well, that, of course, well, what's that purpose? So you have to ask that question. But he gets into the virtues, and he says there's a right way to act under any circumstance. There's a right way to act. And if you act less than or more than that, that's a vice. That's what vices are. Vices are when you act more or less than the exact right way, which is hard to do. We're human beings. We get it wrong, even when we have good intentions. So this is a lifelong pursuit to act virtuously, to truly act virtuously in a consistent manner. And in the classic example, he names like 13 virtues in ethics. I think my favorite, because it just seems to be the easiest to understand, is courage. There's a right way to be. There's a right way to exhibit courage in any given situation. And it may look different for different people in different circumstances, and we'll get to how you discern that in a minute. But if you're not courageous enough, that's cowardice. That's a vice. If you act rashly, if you are too courageous, if your courage is misguided and you just charge the enemy when they've got a cannon and machine guns and all you've got is a spear, that's rashness. So you're over the mark. And so there's too little and there's too much. You've got courage, right, is the mean, it's in the center, and then to the side you've got cowardice or rashness. And he does the same thing with temperance, liberality, magnificence, or liberality being generosity, pride, temper, praiseworthiness, truth, ready-wittedness, friendliness, modesty, righteous indignation. He's got this big list that he goes through and says there's a right way to act under any circumstance, depending on the people that are present, the circumstances that they're in, what you can give, what you can do. So it's this difficult, complicated thing. And so you have to spend your whole life trying to always act in the right way. And the picture that comes to my mind, use another movie reference, since that seems to be our cultural common, what we can all, right. We all watch Star Wars.
Medium of communication.
It's our cultural underpinning, right? Our cultural literacy. There's a movie, Apollo 13, that is about the fated, trip where they were supposed to land on the moon, but there was a manufacturing defect that they didn't discover until they were in space, and so they couldn't land on the moon, and then suddenly became a rescue mission to try to get them back. And Tom Hanks starred in it and so forth. But there's this one scene where on the return trip to Earth, they've got two pilots. They've got the two pilots on both sides of the ship controlling the thrusters on each side of their spacecraft, and each one of them are looking through a window, and in the window they see Earth, and they have to both be working together and using the thrusters to keep the Earth in the center of their window, because if they don't, the angle of attack, the angle of approach to Earth will be too big or too little, and either they'll burn up in the atmosphere or they'll bounce off the atmosphere and go off into space and be lost forever. And it's this really tense moment as they're like using their controls, and they're like, and they're a little bit of thrust, a little bit of you're going too much to that side. That's like an analogy or a parable of life right there in terms of virtue. Is this constant adjusting and trying to get better and better and better at doing the right thing in the right way to the right people in the right amount of time, in every interaction you have. It's a huge undertaking. But what it does is it builds this thing he calls character, and it becomes habit. As you get better and better at it, you don't have to think about it as much, and it becomes habit, and you can then focus on the next virtue. You can focus on taking it to the next level. So you're living in a virtuous way throughout your entire life, trying to build character. And it's like, well, okay, that's great, but how do you know the right way to act? How do you know what is the way you should act? And he says, well, everyone is born with this internal guide that tells us the right way to act. He says, I don't know where it came from. I think it's of divine origin, he said. I call it reason, right rule. Those are all phrases he uses to describe it. But there's a voice. There's this voice inside each of us, and we have to cultivate it, listen to it, act in accordance with it. That's our guide. And so if you follow this voice that he calls reason, some might call it conscience, for example, every human has it, and you have to follow it and live in accordance with it. And that's your guide to be virtuous in any given instance. And he said, you got to watch out, because if you don't live according to that, in accordance with that voice, it will get quieter and quieter until you basically become a beast. And he talks about how men can become beasts. And that's a terrible place for a human being to be, but they no longer hear that voice. And so they act as a beast. So you've got acting virtuously, building habit and character over the course of a lifetime by listening to this internal guide that he calls reason. And the thinkers that came after him, Cicero, Locke, etc., they all built upon this idea of what is reason, where does it come from? Every human has it. And so you see it in their writings, and it is very interesting. Well, I won't go. I'll stay with Aristotle here for a minute. But happiness is basically the pursuit of virtue by listening to that inner voice, practicing over a lifetime, developing virtuous habits that make up character. It's like, okay, is that all there is to it? He says, well, there is this thing I call a complete life, which consists of 4 things. You've got to live a life of virtue and justice. Justice, by the way, is once you get to this point where you are managing yourself, you have learned and become to a degree that you're managing yourself in a virtuous manner pretty consistently, you then seek those same virtues for all of your fellow men. You seek that the right is done to them at the right time in the right amount for the right reason, etc. And that's called justice. It's the highest virtue. So there we see this bridge from individual to community. And he then builds from there. He says, so you've got to live a life of virtue and justice. Second, you've got to develop practical judgment. That is a knowledge of things that change, because change is all around us. Third, you need to attain wisdom. That is a knowledge of things that don't change. And then fourth, and this was a big surprise to me, you have to acquire sufficient property to sustain life and ideally allow for you to be generous and magnanimous, which are 2 of the virtues. Generosity is what all of us should practice. It's giving to those around us, even if it hurts. Magnanimity is if you are wealthy, you give on a great scale. And so that's where you start to see like, oh, wait a second. So the complaints that people have against capitalism, if you're just looking at the Aristotelian model, because we could get into the Christian model too, which has something to say on the same subject, but if there's a problem with the rich not giving back, that's not a problem of capitalism. They're not following Aristotle. Or you might say Christ, who also said, take and sell everything and follow me. So there and give to the poor and all of that. So there's these models that have a way of taking care of society. The question is, what layer really talks about that? So Aristotle says generosity and magnanimity are the way you then give back to society and support those who need support. So that's a really quick it's a really quick way of just summarizing what Aristotle said on happiness. That happiness comes from that virtue, character, reason model, and it just balloons from there. So for example, he says that as you live that way, the relationships you have with other people, which are a source of great pleasure, which that's great. Let's get that kind of pleasure of relationships with people. There's three different kinds of relationships. There's or friendships. There's friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and friendships of virtue. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with friendships of utility or pleasure. Those are relationships you have mostly because you do something for each other. And there's your one friend has a boat and the other friend has an airplane, and so you take each other on trips or whatever. That's a friendship of utility, where one has something the other doesn't have, and so you're able to, there's a reciprocity there. Friendships of pleasure, you get something pleasurable from that relationship, and so that's why you're there. That's why you engage in that and you maintain that. A friendship of virtue, though, however, is a friendship of two people or more who have done this Aristotle path, who have become what being virtuous makes you become, and that the wisdom you share, the judgment you share, the experiences you share in doing that together are very rewarding. And I'll give a personal example of where I feel like I've experienced that to some degree in my life. My wife and I were once asked to lead a 300-person historical reenactment. It's called a pioneer trek, where everyone gets dressed up as American pioneers from our religion and reenact what they went through. And it's an enormous amount of work. It took us 2 years, we instead of one because of COVID, but we spent 2 years planning this thing, and we worked with 100 other adults in our community. And spent those 2 years meeting with them, organizing with them, and each of them had their parts. And we had meetings every month, and even often more frequently, to help 200 kids. It was 100 adults to help 200 kids, and it was all selfless. It was not about us. It was about providing these young people with a certain kind of an experience. And so we weren't doing it for ourselves. So I feel like it was a virtuous pursuit in a way. Yeah. And the feelings that I have towards these people, these 100 adults that I work with, not to mention the 200 young people, it's just like we are like connected forever because of the work we did together that had nothing to do with us, but we were serving what we thought was a higher purpose. And that's one example of, you do that, you multiply that across many people, across many years and many communities, and you get these tight-knit relationships. And he says that's what builds cities. That's another connection you got from Aristotle. He says it goes from individual virtue to relationship virtue to now polity or societal. Those are the people who build and maintain cities when it's done well. And rightly are these people of this particular caliber. They then get together and they help run and govern and organize society. Now you can have debates about how well we do that, and you can go and look at different areas of the country or the world and see where is that happening versus where is that not. But that was Aristotle's idea, is that you start with yourself, it then expands to relationships that you have, and then that creates people who are then able to create good societies. So you see this complete model of how individual behavior impacts societal well-being and human flourishing, and it's beautiful. And so the question that I ask for anyone who says that we don't need Aristotle anymore is like, okay, fine. What are you going to replace him with? What theory of human flourishing are you going to create, or are you going to look at, are you going to find that replaces that model? Because that's the model, the Christians came along and adopted that and said, totally compatible with what we're doing, and continued to build upon that and added this. I mean, I think you're going to find the theological in Aristotle as well. He talks about how happiness is the life of the gods, how they're the source of reason, they're the voice that's speaking to us. And he wasn't Christian, but he's saying there is this higher power, there's something higher than us, and it's related. They're the ones who are exemplifying life for us. We should seek to be like them, and so it was very Christian compatible. And so you get the great Christian philosophers, for example, building on Aristotle and Cicero and Christ, and that's where. And so anyway, it's beautiful, and it took hundreds of years, thousands of years to come up with that. If you're going to reject that, okay, let's have that conversation. That's part of the great conversation, right? Mm-hmm. Let's have that conversation, but good luck with that. You've got to read everything they wrote and everything everyone wrote after them and find the holes, because maybe it did get corrupted along the way. I think there are places where it got corrupted. And we need to try to get back to or find where did it get corrupted, and let's correct and fix that. So that would be my argument to those who, and I've seen it online, people rejecting those people who thought before, and it's very easy to do. It's very comforting to do. It's a lot of work you save yourself if you don't have to go and read all of those books and have those hard conversations and wrestle with it. But in that sense, you are in a very real way, throwing away the learning that the engineer needs to build bridges, airplanes, and buildings. You're throwing away the medical, meaning that this is an art. The art of happiness and human flourishing is an art that has been studied. It's a science that has been studied for thousands of years. Are you going to? It's an act of great hubris to just throw it out and say, I'm going to come up with my own thing, or to just ignore it and say, let's go with this person over here. Like Marx, for example. Marx has a whole different theory on human flourishing, and it can be extremely convincing, and has been. You look at communist China, you look at North Korea, you look at Cuba, you look at Venezuela. Enormous swaths of humans have, over the last 100 years in particular, been convinced by it. And it's only if you know the other side. Yeah, now we can see the fruits. So the people who were first starting, we can forgive them a little because maybe it was theoretical at that point. Now we know the fruits, and yet we still have people who haven't studied either, classic liberalism and illiberal philosophies like Marx. So you have people espousing, shouting the slogans of, putting on their social media, ideas that flow from the Hegelian Marx concepts, which we haven't even gotten into those. Because they haven't studied either one of them, they can't discern the asteroid fields ahead of them on the path that we're trying to navigate.
Yeah, and just very, very simply, we can look at the fruits. North Korea, Cuba, China, Venezuela. Okay, they are in the fruit stage. Do you want to live in that type of a country? Or do you want to live in a type of country like America where maybe you disagree with a lot of things that's going on, but you can disagree and not be put to death for it?
Yeah, and I mean, and I would wonder how many people have really even studied those fruits. I think most people don't study the fruits of either. Yeah. And so they hear the slogans and sounds great to them. And they don't realize the depth, because they haven't studied the depth. And it's not entirely their fault, because we haven't taught them the depth. Our education system does not go into any of this. And so you have things changing underfoot, and you don't even know. I mean, one example, and I shared this in that podcast with Greg too, so you're already familiar with it, but like the meaning of the word equality, it means something different depending on the moral layer, the moral and political layer that the person who's saying that word is coming from. So for example, under the liberal perspective, equality simply means equality under the law. It just means that if you break this law, if you try to rob someone of life or liberty, then the law will treat you the same as the next person who does that. That's equality. It's equality under the law. It's not equality of talent. It's not equality of birth. It's not equality of wealth. It's equality under the law. That's what equality means under classic liberalism. Under progressivism, and we didn't even get into, exploring all three of these. That's worth a whole nother, conversation. But under progressivism, equality means equality of opportunity. That it is under classic liberalism, the only job of government, and there's a whole reason why that's another conversation in and of itself. The whole purpose of government is to preserve life and liberty, life, liberty, and property. Property coming from Aristotle's, one of his four elements of happiness. The complete life was property. And so when Jefferson originally wrote life, liberty, and property in the Declaration of Independence, why did he switch it to happiness? Well, it makes sense if you've read Aristotle, because property is a component of happiness. And I think it was Benjamin Franklin. They're not exactly sure, but they believe it was Benjamin Franklin. He said, no, don't just stop with property. Go with the bigger goal, happiness. That came right out of Aristotle. And it's perfectly clear if you just go read Ethics. So under classic liberalism, because the founders understood power. They understood human nature and power, how dangerous power is. That's why government was so limited And that's a whole nother conversation too, that we don't really have, that our youth who go to school don't ever really learn the lessons that had been learned about power and how power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the structure, the complexity of under the Constitution, that model, the complexity was there to channel and deflect, and it's all about power. That's what the Constitution was written to channel and separate power. And so government was the only thing that government was for was to protect life, liberty, and property from being unjustly acted against. Well, that wasn't good enough for the progressives. The progressives said, no, we want to use the power of government, because government is force. So under classic liberalism, force is used to prevent you or to punish you if you seek the life, liberty, or property of your neighbor. Under progressivism, they said that wasn't enough. We want to use the power or force of government to also do good. We want to solve society's problems. We want to heal the sick. We want to educate the ignorant. We want to liberate the captive. We want to...
Which absolves the individual of that responsibility.
Which absolves the individual. Yeah, that's a big problem with... I mean, I want to do all those things too. I want to educate the ignorant. I want to see those things done. I don't know that I can do all of them, but that's one of the unintended side effects, I believe, of progressivism, is that it absolved the individual. And Aristotle talked about this. It's, your happiness comes from you doing those things, participating in that greater societal sphere and bringing justice to your fellow man, and being an active part of that, being involved in institutions, non-governmental institutions and societies that solve those problems. And it brings enormous sense of well-being, happiness, and pleasure and joy from participating in that. And under progressivism, that was delegated to the government. So now equality is opportunity is a quality of opportunity. So now we need to make sure everyone through force starts out on an even playing field. So we need to make sure everyone's equal in terms of medical, education, whatever it happens to be. And which is a noble goal, I would say. I think the most noble among them, they had good desires, I think, but they weren't. They were ignoring some of the warnings of why the government shouldn't be the source of that. It should be we the people, but not we the people through the government. Nowadays, what we're having, equality now means under the Marxian model, it's equality of outcome, which means everyone needs to end up in the same place. And so you have to have government use force to have quotas on hiring, and have everyone reach the same destination, the finishing line at the same time. And while that it's utopian in nature, that sounds wonderful, but the force required to do that by imperfect humans and the corruption that can easily flow from that, that's what's unexplored. So anyway, the point being that if you haven't studied these things, you don't even see the arc of the change of the words. Racism now means something different. Equality means something different. Man means something different. Woman means something different. There's an entire vocabulary shift. Liberty means something. There's a shift occurring in our society as those plates, shift. And because we have a short lifespan, I mean, I think you can kind of see the shifts happening quicker now, but we're like the frog in the pot that just sees the water getting warmer, but we don't have, because we haven't studied these things, we don't have the longer perspective to realize just how far we've moved, and we don't understand the warnings that have already been made against some of the policies and ideas that are being espoused today.
Yeah. Well, I love this conversation. Thank you very much for having it with me, Gary. One thing I do want to hit on before we wrap up here, what can individuals do? Because that's one of the biggest things for me, and how to rewrite your stars. Obviously we're talking about societal things here, but what can an individual do?
I feel like the individual purpose that we want to pursue, it exists within a framework of being. We have to, Buddha was credited with saying, and I've since learned that he didn't actually say it, that your purpose of life is to find your purpose in life and then to devote your whole life to it. Apparently, he didn't actually say that, but it's a very useful phrase, I feel. There are things that are going to prevent you from, well, that for me, part of our if you live in the West, if you live in America, part of your purpose in life is to perpetuate the freedoms that you inherited. Now, there's going to be more to your purpose. I have multiple purposes. Being a father, being a husband, being a member of a community. There's being a son. It's a multifaceted, right? But there is one that is common to us all, I believe, which is perpetuating and improving, that justice concept from Aristotle. So what do? We have to understand it. Go take classes from Hillsdale, for example. They have online free courses that anyone can take to understand these ideas. Go purchase the Great Book set. Go start listening to podcasts. Actually read it. And it's hard, but in 5 years, you're either going to be more educated than you are now, or you're going to be the same. Give up some of that Netflix and Amazon Prime and Disney Plus time. Even give up some of that sports, watching time. We are awash in distraction because we think someone else is handling it. We think someone else is handling the freedom perpetuation thing. Just like we think dentists are handling teeth, engineers are handling bridges, pilots are handling planes, someone else is handling freedom, but they're not. That is one area that must be held in common with us all. And so what can we do? I think that's the one area that Americans are grossly out of step, is with that responsibility, because it isn't one that can be delegated. As soon as you delegate it, power begins to centralize, power corrupts, and then fully centralized and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's plenty of examples of how that's happening. And we need to do this before it's too late. The controls, the protections, the checks, the balances are being eroded, are being bypassed, are being cut away. And it may be, I don't think we're there yet, but we will get to the point where the power no longer is in the people, that the vested interests are simply too strong and cannot be changed except through the shedding of blood. And that's a place I hope we never go. So study, give up something and study.
Yeah, give up something simple rather than having to give up life.
Yes. You're going to pay a price. You or your posterity are going to pay a price one way or another. Let it be you instead of your children, and let it be books instead of blood.
I love that. And, it goes right back to you have to be the change you want to see in the world. I have to be the change I want to see in the world. Gary, you have to be the change you want to see in the world. So, whenever I talk to somebody and they're like, oh man, this, that, the other, blah, 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 if I feel like they're open to hearing it, or sometimes if they're not even, I'll be like, okay, are you willing to do what you want that person to do? Like if you want billionaires to be giving all this money away, are you giving money away within your capacity? If you want people to be treating the elderly right, are you treating the elderly right? If you want people to be doing XYZ, are you doing XYZ? We can't just shed off all responsibility. We have to be responsible ourselves.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on our closing here, so maybe I'll just share this one last quote from John Adams that I think just says it really well. He said, and he was part of the founding, of course, but he said, the science of government, it is my duty to study more than all the other sciences. The arts of legislation and administration and negotiation ought to take place of, indeed exclude in manner all other arts. I must study politics and war, that our sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Our sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. The idea being that there's this hierarchy of how we can spend our time. If you don't have freedom, it's very few people, very few artists that are going to be spending their time doing painting, poetry, music, and architecture. They're not going to be able to. That opportunity is not going to be available to them. And so there's a degree to which all of us, in order to perpetuate those freedoms so that we all can pursue our purpose, that's part of our purpose, is to perpetuate the freedoms that allow everyone in the future, including our posterity, to find and follow their purpose.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gary. I hope for the listener, you've been able to get at least a snippet of what we're talking about here. You have to take the responsibility. You have to get educated. There's so much that you can learn. And I loved what you mentioned at the end of your podcast with Greg. Not everyone is in the same position to be able to study, but study as you can. Sacrifice, like you said, those streaming services, sacrifice that entertainment so that you can learn. I'm striving to, and I'm not perfect at it, but I know it's important and I know I can do it. And so as I am able to, I'm striving to replace, the entertainment part of leisure with the learning part of leisure.
Yeah, that's a good point there. That word leisure, I think you're aware, comes
Mm-hmm.
from what was originally the Greek word of school, meaning that those who had leisure time, because not everyone did. The slave class didn't have leisure time. They were always doing what the masters bid. And leisure was what those who were citizens and not slaves, they had when if they had time. Once they got to the point where they had time, they spent their leisure time learning. Leisure and school come from the same root word. We have flipped that to where we spend our leisure time, and it's expected to spend your leisure time in in the pursuit of pleasure, in distraction.
Yeah.
And that's just one more word that has lost or changed its meaning over time. And I understand, when I was a young father with little kids, it was all I could do. You're exhausted all the time, going to school or new career, whatever. But as you progress, you do start to see more and more leisure become available to you. And it becomes a habit. It's a hard habit to break, to finish, excuse me, to finish your work day and get through dinner, etc., and you want to spend the rest of the evening relaxing and watching TV or whatever. It's a hard change to make, to switch over to reading books instead, or having conversations with people. But before long, you discover the pleasure in
Yeah.
ideas, the pleasure in conversation, and how it broadens your mind and opens up the world to you, and becomes exciting and delicious, and you don't want to put it down. But there is a barrier that we each have to get through before it becomes enjoyable.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, Gary. For those interested in finding out more about what you do, where can they find that at?
Oh, thank you. They can go to culturestack.online. And from there, there's links to the podcast, which is on Anchor and Spotify and so forth. Pretty infrequent, because I spend a lot of time trying to understand something before I will actually, speak on it. But that's where they can go. Culturestack.online. Thank you.
Excellent. And for listeners, remember, you can rewrite your stars, and a lot of that hinges on taking your individual responsibility for that. And maybe a little bit more of a heavy episode when it comes to responsibility, but I think it is very, very important that we recognize and understand this. And even if you're not in the United States of America, I know I have a lot of listeners outside of the United States. It's important wherever you are to understand your responsibility with yourself and your responsibility with your community and your nation. And go out there, rewrite your stars, and make sure you're standing on the shoulders of the giants and understanding them before you just start toppling them.
Awesome. Thanks, Benjamin.